Hello everyone, I'm going to be talking about muzzles, grips, and recoil in general. So which one's the best, which one's not. So I started with figuring out what information was already out there. I did come across this post where from 2022 that there was this person who tested the brakes, the grips, and a couple other things that have been removed from the game, like customizable stocks from weapons. But obviously we don't have that anymore. He did test a lot of things like flashlights, because apparently they used to have a effect on recoil, but now it appears that they do not. A lot of these things were very accurate. Obviously there was a few things that were outdated, but I decided to test out a lot of this stuff for my own and just to get updated information. So with my testing with the G36C, that is the weapon I chose to use. I used it with no muzzle and no grip, and you're seeing just the relative recoil pattern of how the bullets behave. I am not moving or doing anything. Now, if you notice here, there are some ricochets and they're causing some different variation in bullet trajectory, but it's okay. It's not big of a deal. We can still see the big line and we understand, how it works. So the first thing I added was the suppressor. So the suppressor does seem to reduce your recoil a little bit. But what's funny is that there are other things that it does, reducing the muzzle flash, including making the weapon more accurate. I couldn't really tell in terms of like the accuracy or muzzle flash. I do get into the muzzle flash later, but in terms of functionality, it doesn't really add much more recoil reduction than the other two brakes. So the second brake I did was the ASR. As you can see, it does have less recoil than the SOCOM suppressor. But the best one of all, with the most amount of recoil reduction, was the last one. And I was surprised that it had this much recoil. It also hides the muzzle flash as well. But as you can see, it has the best recoil control. So realistically, I'm just going to tell you right off the bat, this is the best muzzle brake that you're going to want to use. And then I started testing out the grips. So I start with the vertical grip. And as you might suspect, this is, as you can kind of compare to the silencer, it's basically the same amount of recoil reduction. It ends up being very close. I'm trying to make everything as even as possible, but sometimes you just can't do that. And I did try out the other combat grips and such, but I had a real big issue with actually noticing any difference. So I ended up just skipping and going to the other one that reduces vertical recoil. And you'll notice that it's basically the same amount of recoil as the other vertical grip. So it actually doesn't really matter which one as far as I am aware. So just pick one that has vertical recoil grip. The other attachments for the grips didn't seem to ever really make a difference that I was able to witness, as a lot of the weapons are very accurate in terms of where you're shooting. It's going to land usually exactly where you're pointing. And as for horizontal recoil, there isn't enough horizontal recoil in the weapon system since a lot of them are just straight vertical. So after testing all the grips, I did start testing out the muzzle flash and seeing if it made a big difference. First, I started with the SOCOM suppressor, and it didn't really seem to obscure anything in the darkest areas. I also used night vision as well, and it still seemed very functional. There were S's escaping, but none of them were bright, so it didn't blow out your night vision. So if you are going to use night vision, it is totally acceptable to use a suppressor. Honestly, the brake, as we'll get to shortly, is basically still going to be your best choice. Then I started with the ASR brake, which, as you can see, there is a very large noticeable muzzle flash, and under night vision, as you can see some obstruction from the actual sight. Honestly, I don't understand the benefit of ever using the ASR brake. It does seem to be the worst one out of all of them. But generally speaking, if you're trying to minimize recoil, the other brake is just going to be way more valuable. And when it comes to the suppressor, you're probably just end up going to be using the suppressor most of the time if you are going under night vision. And then I tested the last brake, which is, as I said, the best one for recoil. It does have a little bit of a muzzle flash, but it's so minor where it's not really that much of an obstruction. So honestly, even under night vision, I do still recommend this muzzle brake. As you can see, it's such a small, minor muzzle flash. I don't think it would really ever be an issue for anybody. And it does have the best recoil reduction, so this is probably going to be the one you're always going to be choosing, with the exception of if you want to be a little bit more quiet. Make sure not to yell if you are. And here is the muzzle flash, or lack thereof, testing in lit conditions. There really wasn't much of a difference in terms of visibility. A lot of the time, you could make out your target and hit your target accurately. I'm sure when it comes to using night vision, it's probably more impactful to choose the correct muzzle brake. But as I said, the best muzzle brake is SFMB. Not every weapon has a muzzle brake available, and there are some weapons that have built-in muzzles. So, for example, like the Elvar, it actually doesn't have a option to change the muzzle because it has an integrated suppressor. Obviously, I can't test and compare with something like this, but it does appear to behave very similarly to an attached suppressor. And addressing the silencer increase in accuracy, I did try to test various ways of how to gauge accuracy, but it does seem to be so inconsistent, and I couldn't really get a good actual measurement of the differences, since a lot of the variables were kind of a little bit more difficult to control because I needed to aim at a target, and there's weapon sway and there's aftershot recoil, and I tried various ways of doing this, but it just didn't really end up showing very many differences. So when it comes to the accuracy or other things that aren't vertical recoil or muzzle brake flash, there's really nothing else to consider, really. So a lot of the grips that just don't have vertical recoil aren't really worth your time unless you just want it for the looks, which is totally fine, since I'm going to be basically be doing the same. The aim down sight zooms and the horizontal recoil just didn't seem to be measurable enough to matter any significant amount. So when it comes to the muzzle brakes, I recommend taking the SFMB. It is the one that has the best recoil reduction, as well as it does reduce the muzzle flash. So under night vision, you're not going to be blinding your team when you're under night vision, allowing everybody to see a bit better. And then when it comes to the grips, every grip that says vertical recoil reduction, you're going to pick that. It doesn't matter which one. They appear to be the same amount of recoil reduction. So the SBFM and any grip that says vertical recoil reduction is going to be the one you're going to be choosing for the best weapon performance overall. So those are my recommendations. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Anyway, that's the end of the video. So thanks for watching and have a good day.